The first slice across my meadow looked like a wound, fresh, ugly, and deliberate. Bright orange flags danced in the morning wind like taunts, leading my eye across a trench I never approved, carved straight through the center of land I had spent 15 years building my life on. Yellow pipe lay coiled and gleaming in the dirt like something that had been there for years, as if it belonged. Heavy machinery stood abandoned nearby, wheels gouging the soil so deep they'd take months of rain to heal. That land is my spine, my breath, my proof that I built a life entirely on my own terms. And overnight, strangers had cut it open and stamped someone else's logo where my name should have been. When I called the HOA, the president's voice was sugared poison. "It's for the community," she said. Funny. The community doesn't seem to need forged signatures, midnight engines, and a notary who swears she watched my hand move on a document I never touched. I locked my gate, grabbed my camera, and made myself one promise. If they wanted a fight, I would bring a floodlight to their shadows and a paper trail straight to their lies. My 20 acres of rolling land in Redwood County had always been more than property. When I bought it 15 years earlier, I made sure every document spelled out one thing with absolute clarity: this land would never, under any circumstance, fall under HOA control. No neighbors telling me how high the grass should be. No fines for the color of my shutters. No self-appointed tyrants arriving at my door with clipboards. Freedom. That was the real purchase price. So picture what it felt like to step onto my porch on an ordinary morning, coffee in hand, sun barely up, and see that blaze of orange flags cutting across my meadow like a neon scar. From a distance, they almost looked festive. Up close, my stomach turned. My first thought was that there had been a mistake. Maybe the contractors had misread a map or taken a wrong turn down my private gravel road. No one had asked my permission. No letters, no notices, no knock at my door. Yet here they were, on my land, in my earth, with their pipe and their machinery and their absolute indifference to the fact that none of this belonged to them. I crouched beside the trench and touched the cold metal pipe. It wasn't even buried yet, just left sitting there like a claim staked by someone else. My chest tightened. This wasn't a minor trespass. This was someone telling me I didn't matter. Then I spotted the sign. Nailed into a wooden post a few feet from the trench: Community Safety Initiative, Authorized Gas Line Installation. And at the bottom, in bold letters, the name I had specifically paid to avoid: Redwood Hills Homeowners Association. Their emblem, a neat little oak tree inside a circle, stamped across the wood like an official decree. My mouth went dry. I stormed back to the house and dialed the HOA office number. A receptionist answered as though I had interrupted something more important. I told her who I was. I told her what was on my land. She shuffled papers and told me in a flat, disinterested voice that it was all part of the Community Safety Initiative, that gas lines were being modernized across Redwood Hills to meet safety standards. I said my land wasn't part of Redwood Hills and never had been. I said they had no jurisdiction here. Her response was almost bored. "According to our records, we have the owner's signature on file." Those words hit me like a slap. My voice cracked. "That's impossible. I never signed anything." She suggested I speak with HOA President Cassandra Pike and transferred me to a hold music that went dead after several minutes. Deliberately, I suspected. They wanted me suspended in silence, frustrated, powerless, and alone. I wasn't going to give them that. I grabbed my truck keys and drove into town. The Redwood Hills HOA kept their office in a small gray building squeezed between a nail salon and a dry cleaner. Hardly the fortress I had imagined for such brazen people. But as I pushed through the glass door, the air carried stale coffee and smug authority. The receptionist barely looked up when I demanded to see Cassandra. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but I'm not leaving until I speak with her." A sigh, a phone call, and moments later, a tall woman in a sleek navy suit emerged from the back office. Perfect hair, a smile so rehearsed it could have been painted on. She introduced herself as Cassandra Pike, HOA president, and extended her hand warmly. I ignored it. I told her I wanted to know why there was a trench and a gas line on my property without my permission. Her smile didn't falter. She called it the Community Safety Initiative. She said gas lines were being modernized to bring everyone into compliance. I said my property wasn't part of her HOA and never had been. she said, with eyes gleaming like a predator who has already made its decision that according to updated records, my land had been incorporated into their jurisdiction 2 years ago and that they had my signature authorizing the work. My fists clenched. That signature is a forgery, I said. She tilted her head and told me those were serious allegations. If I wished to dispute them, I was welcome to pursue legal channels. In the meantime, the project would proceed. I told her she was trespassing and that if the work didn't stop immediately, I'd call the sheriff. Her smile dropped to something thinner and colder. She advised caution before obstructing a project designed for community safety. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. I turned and walked out before my rage got the better of me. Back in my truck, I gripped the steering wheel hard enough to whiten my knuckles. 2 questions burned through everything else. Who had forged my signature? And what game was Cassandra Pike actually playing? When I reached my driveway, dusk was settling over the hills. I went straight back to the trench with a flashlight, scanning the ground until something caught my eye. A white envelope wedged under one of the orange flags. I pulled it free and brushed off the dirt. Inside was a copy of the supposed authorization letter, with my name scrolled across the bottom, a crude imitation of my handwriting. Anyone who knew my signature would see it in a moment. This wasn't incompetence. This was deliberate fraud. I stuffed the document in my jacket and went back inside. That night, I spread the forged authorization beside my deed on the dining table and compared them. The deed was ironclad. My property was explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction. No gray area, no loopholes, not even a comma's worth of ambiguity. Yet here was proof they were willing to lie, to forge, to trespass, all to sink their hooks into land that had never been theirs. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the silhouette of the trench under the moonlight, my sanctuary sitting there invaded and tainted. This wasn't about safety or community improvement. It was about control. And I swore to myself that they had just picked the wrong man to steal from. By the time the sun rose, I had already made one call. Marian Torres had been my attorney for years. Old friend, tough as nails, the kind of lawyer who treats fraud the way a surgeon treats infection, with focus, speed, and no sentiment. When I finished laying out the details, she went quiet for exactly long enough that I could practically hear her sharpening her instruments. Then we hit back hard, she said. Forgery is criminal. Trespass is civil and criminal. They've overstepped every boundary. I'll have a cease and desist drafted by end of day. Document everything. Photos, video, timestamps. Don't confront them alone again. Those words steadied me. For the first time since finding the trench, I wasn't a lone man raging against a machine. I had a weapon. I spent that morning patrolling my property like a man on watch. The trench looked even uglier in daylight. Muddy piles of dirt scarring the meadow, orange flags fluttering in the breeze like pennants of conquest. I photographed every inch, every gouge, every piece of abandoned machinery. I measured the trench and marked its path. Then I drove into the county records office and asked the clerk to pull up my property information. His brow furrowed as he stared at the screen. According to this, your land was annexed into Redwood Hills HOA jurisdiction 2 years ago. My heart skipped. He swiveled the monitor. There it was, a scanned amendment with my property listed and my signature at the bottom. Same sloppy forgery as the authorization letter, notarized by someone named Brenda Holcomb. That's not my handwriting, I said. That's fraud. The clerk leaned in and lowered his voice. You're not the first landowner to say that. The HOA has been expanding aggressively, but you're the first I've seen with actual proof of forgery. He told me I would need to file a formal dispute and that the amendment would be flagged for review. Time, he said. It would take time. Time was exactly what they wanted. Enough of it for their pipeline to be laid and their lies to be cemented into the ground right along with it. When I pulled back into my driveway, I skidded to a halt. Parked outside my gate was a massive excavator, its steel bucket lowered just inches from the chain and padlock I had installed the night before. No workers, no supervisors. Just the machine left there, like a message, a silent threat crouching in my driveway, waiting to remind me that they could return whenever they chose. I marched inside and called Marian. They're trying to intimidate you, she said. They want you to feel cornered. Don't give them that satisfaction. The injunction request would go in the next day. If they kept working after that, they'd be in contempt of court. I held on to her words, but that night I couldn't rest. Every sound, tires on gravel, the distant hum of an engine, pulled me to the window. I installed motion sensor lights across the property line and rigged a makeshift alarm with tin cans strung by wire across the gate. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like less of prey. Just after midnight, a black SUV rolled slowly along the edge of my land, headlights off, engine barely above a whisper. It paused near the excavator, then circled again, testing the fence line the way a predator tests a perimeter before committing. I held my phone ready. I let them circle. I let them drive away. I didn't sleep a wink. Morning came, and so did escalation. I was sanding a chair in my workshop when I heard the engines again. I rushed outside. 3 trucks parked at my gate. Men in reflective vests and hard hats clustered together, clipboards ready. One of them yanked at the chain. "Private property," I shouted, striding forward. "You're trespassing." The man with the clipboard said they were there on behalf of Redwood Hills HOA to continue the installation. I needed to remove the gate immediately, or they would involve law enforcement. The audacity nearly floored me. I told him clearly that they had already broken the law. Forgery, trespass, property damage. If anyone was calling law enforcement today, it was me. He told me they had all necessary permits and that my signature was on file. My voice was steady, but my pulse was not. "That signature is forged. I have proof. Touch this gate and you'll regret it." One of the trucks shifted into reverse, edging closer as if considering whether to ram the gate. I stepped forward. "If you damage my property, you will answer for it personally." The driver hesitated. The man with the clipboard raised a hand. The truck stopped. His eyes were cold when he looked at me. We'll be back. This isn't over." They turned and left in a cloud of dust. My hands were trembling, but I was still standing on my own land. That evening, I sat alone in the workshop, the smell of sawdust mixing with tension, staring at the trench through the window. The jagged line cutting across my meadow looked less like construction and more like a declaration of war. And I realized something that settled through me like cold water. This wasn't just a fight over a pipe. This was a war over control, and the HOA had already decided to win by any means necessary. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the man whose land they had cut open. The next morning, I found a notary's name on the forged annexation document, Brenda Holcomb. My gut said that name wasn't a coincidence. I searched the HOA's own website. There she was, listed as an HOA board member, a notary who had signed off on my supposed consent while simultaneously sitting on the board that stood to benefit from it. That wasn't just a conflict of interest, that was criminal. I forwarded everything to Marion. She called back within an hour. "Jackson, this is bigger than I thought. If a board member notarized forged signatures, we're looking at felony territory, fraud, conspiracy. We'll file the cease and desist today and push for an injunction tomorrow. We should also prepare a counterclaim, trespass, property damage, harassment. You've got the evidence." Her confidence gave me a flicker of light in what had felt like a very long tunnel. But I also knew people like Cassandra Pike didn't simply pack up their operation because a judge told them to. I drove out to meet a neighbor I trusted, a rancher named Franklin Henders, who had lived on the edge of Redwood County for 40 years and had fought his own quiet battles with the HOA a decade earlier. Over coffee at a diner, he leaned close and told me what he knew. "They tried the same thing with me 10 years ago," he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug. "Claimed my cattle pens violated setback requirements, hauled me into hearings, slapped me with fines for a solid year before I finally sold 5 acres just to make them stop. I thought I was the only one. Looking at what you're facing, Jackson, they're getting bolder." I asked him why nobody had stopped them. "Because most folks don't have the fight in them," he said simply. "HOAs wear you down. They count on it, but you've got something most don't. Proof and the willingness to use it." When we left, he pressed a folded paper into my hand, old correspondence from his own HOA battle. Fines, demands, intimidation letters. The language matched mine almost word for word. The pattern was unmistakable. They ran on intimidation and fraud, dressed up as community improvement, and they had been getting away with it for decades. That evening, a new envelope appeared in my mailbox. Thick, embossed letterhead from a law firm. Inside was a demand for $75,000 in damages for delays caused by my cease and desist. $75,000 for daring to protect my own land. The tone was smug, almost taunting. I called Marion immediately. She read it and let out a humorless laugh. "They're bluffing," she said. "They want you scared into backing down, but they just handed us more ammunition. This is harassment, plain and simple. We'll file a counterclaim and include this letter." Then she paused. "Jackson, who else has this happened to?" That question burned in my chest all night. I sat at my desk with a yellow legal pad and wrote out a list. Every neighbor I knew, every landowner on the outskirts who might have been quietly pushed around by the same machine. If they thought I was going to stand here alone, they were dead wrong. I also hired a handwriting expert on Marion's recommendation. I met the analyst in a small office lined with books and signature samples, the kind of place where the whole business is distinguishing truth from imitation. She examined my genuine signature on my deed, then laid it beside the one on the amendment. "This isn't the same hand," she said, pointing to differences in the pressure, the loops, the way certain letters closed. "This is a forgery." Clumsy. Someone copied the look, but not the movement. Validation? Yes, but also danger, because a forgery, this deliberate, pointed to intention, not accident. Someone had manufactured my consent, that someone had a name, and her name was Brenda Holcomb. Then I found something that changed the entire shape of what I was fighting. The pipe in my trench wasn't standard residential grade. The casing was industrial. Thick, reinforced metal of the kind you don't use for neighborhood gas lines. At one point along its length, I found a small access panel bolted shut with tamper-proof screws. I worked it open with a screwdriver from my workshop and shone my flashlight inside. What I saw made the hair on my neck stand straight up. A neat junction box with a logo I recognized, Meridian Grid. Marion had mentioned Meridian before. They were a private firm that specialized in large-scale infrastructure, data hubs, industrial transmission projects. This pipe was not carrying gas. Running along the main conduit were thin coaxial cables of the kind used for data transmission. Someone had disguised a corporate data pipeline as a community utility upgrade and was trying to run it straight through my land without my knowledge, my permission, or my name anywhere on the actual plan. I photographed everything. Every angle, every label, the serial number etched into the module. Then I called Marion. Her voice had that quiet edge, equal parts excitement and cold fury. "Get those images to me and the county recorder immediately. We need subpoenas for Meridian's contracts and any payment trails to the HOA. If Meridian is financing this, there's a paper chain somewhere. We find it, and this stops being a neighborhood dispute. It becomes something else entirely." Within days, I reached out to Leah Morris, a young investigative journalist I had seen at town meetings, the kind of reporter with that particular hungry look that comes from knowing a powerful story when she smells one. I emailed her the photographs, the timeline, the whole sequence. The trench appears overnight. Forged documents surface. Surati, Archer, and Orai. A notary who sits on the HOA board notarizes the fake amendment. Industrial-grade pipe with Meridian hardware is installed without any proper authorization. Her reply came back in 15 minutes. "So I'm on my way." When she pulled up, she walked the trench with me, took notes, snapped photos, and asked the right questions, the kind that make your jaw tighten because they're exactly what you'd want someone with a microphone asking. Who notarized the amendment? Who Korhausen B. We Sauer benefited financially? Where did the money come from? Within a day, she had flagged a pattern, a string of payments from a shell account linked to Meridian that coincided with annexation filings across 3 properties in the county. Stacked against the forged signatures and the industrial hardware, the pattern stopped being circumstantial and started looking like an accusation written in plain arithmetic. Marion served subpoenas to Meridian Grid for contracts, invoices, and communications with the HOA. Meridian's lawyers responded with the usual corporate playbook, stalling requests, claims of privileged communications, technicalities about redactions, a fortress trying to slow a leak. Meanwhile, forensic accountants dug through the HOA's bank statements and Meridian's vendor lists. Within days, they uncovered a lump sum payment labeled infrastructure consulting flowing from Meridian into a little-known HOA reserve fund. The amounts and dates aligned too neatly with the annexation filings to be coincidental. It was a map of motive. Then Leah called with something that made my skin crawl. She had found an email chain between a Meridian executive and a consultant working with Redwood Hills. She read me one paragraph. "We'll use HOA jurisdiction to formalize corridors and secure rights of way. The residents will think it's for safety." A smoking gun in plain text. To them, people like me weren't neighbors. We were obstacles to be managed. The morning I showed up at my gate to find construction crews attempting to work in defiance of the court injunction, I had my phone recording before I was 20 feet from the fence. I confronted them calmly and put the injunction on record verbally. Then Brenda Holcomb stepped out from the crowd with her polished smile. I pressed record on a second device. She confirmed her presence on the scene. She made statements about the project proceeding. She told me to be careful about interfering with a public safety project. Every word was evidence. That evening in Marion's office, she watched the video and wrote furiously. "She admitted being present on your land despite the cease and desist," Marion said. "She's the same notary on the forged annexation. We're adding criminal fraud and contempt of court to our filings." Then I pulled out a separate recording I'd made at the trench, my close inspection of the access panel and the Meridian junction box. Marion's pen stopped. She looked up. "Wiring inside a supposed gas line means monitoring or data transmission. Jackson, this isn't about utilities. They're running infrastructure through your property under false pretenses, and they're backed by corporate money." The full picture had finally come into focus. By this point, Franklin Henders had brought me two other landowners, Joe and Mara, a couple who had watched the HOA fine them for landscaping violations until they sold 2 acres just to make the harassment stop. Their story matched Franklin's. Franklin's story matched mine. They all matched the threatening demand letters, the midnight trucks, the bogus zoning violations. The HOA had been running the same playbook for years, picking off landowners one at a time, counting on isolation and exhaustion to do what brute force couldn't quite manage openly. That night, we gathered in my workshop, the air thick with sawdust and collective fury, and we made a plan. "Individually, they pick us off," I said. "Together, we fight. We file affidavits. We testify. We make it impossible for them to stay in the shadows." Franklin slapped the table. "Damn right. I've had enough of living scared." One by one, we signed Marion's affidavits, each one a sworn testimony of harassment, fraud, and abuse of power. Each name on each document a piece of the same, larger truth. This HOA had operated as a predator for years, using legal machinery as cover for something that was in no meaningful way legal. 2 nights before the hearing, Cassandra Pike herself showed up at my trench in the dark, floodlights blazing across my meadow, workers hauling pipe in direct contempt of the injunction. I filmed everything, her face, the trucks, the men unloading material. When I confronted her, she stood there with that same arrogance, telling me the project would proceed because the community depended on it. I told her calmly that I had forensic evidence of forgery, email proof of her coordination with Meridian, and her own image on a recording showing contempt of court in progress. For the first time since this began, the mask cracked. Her eyes narrowed. She snapped at the workers to pack up. They left. It wasn't surrender. It was tactical retreat. But I had them on tape, and tape has memory. The hearing was unlike anything I had imagined when this started as a trench in my meadow. Marion moved through the evidence methodically. The forged signature, the forensic expert's testimony with charts showing the differences in pressure and letter form, the Meridian junction box with its coaxial cables, the video of Cassandra overseeing workers in direct violation of the injunction, the affidavits from Franklin, Joe, and Mara. One by one, the pieces stacked up into something undeniable. Then Marion called Brenda Holcomb to the stand. She started with simple procedural questions. "You notarized Mr. Cole's signature on the annexation amendment. Were you present when he signed?" "Yes," Brenda answered, voice clipped. Marion raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Because on that date, Mr. Cole's bank records and phone data place him out of the county entirely. Can you explain that discrepancy?" The room went absolutely silent. Brenda's lips parted. Nothing came. She stammered, glanced toward Cassandra, and said she must have mixed up the dates. Marian's voice sharpened. Isn't it true that you are both a notary and an HOA board member, that you stood to benefit financially from annexations like this one? Brenda's face flushed. I was just following instructions. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge leaned forward. Answer directly, Miss Holcomb. Did you personally witness Mr. Cole sign that amendment? Brenda swallowed. Oh, no, I did not. Gasps across the gallery. Cassandra's jaw tightened hard enough to see from across the room. Marian pressed the advantage, presenting the subpoenaed bank records showing Meridian transfers into the HOA account, timed precisely with the annexation filings. The defense argued good faith, called the payments consulting fees, called Brenda's testimony a memory lapse, but the damage was complete and irreversible. The judge's voice went cold. This court will not tolerate forgery, fraud, or violations of injunctions. An investigation into the HOA's financial dealings is hereby ordered. All construction activity on Mr. Cole's property is permanently barred until resolution. A wave of relief moved through me, tempered only by the sight of Cassandra's eyes across the room. She wasn't finished, but neither was I. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed. Leah was there with her recorder. I kept my statement simple. This isn't just about me. It's about every landowner who's been bullied and lied to. Yes, my signature was forged. Yes, evidence ties Meridian to this project. And no, I'm not afraid. Fear is exactly what they were counting on. That night, alone on my property in the dark, I walked the perimeter with a flashlight. The trench was quiet. The orange flags were gone. My meadow was scarred, but still mine. I thought about what my father had told me when I was young, that land is more than dirt. It's legacy. Guard it like you guard your own blood. I looked at the trench, and I looked at the sky, and I whispered a promise to no one but myself. You tried to steal this from me. You tried to buy me, to break me, to wait me out in the dark. But you forgot one thing. This land is mine, and I don't scare easy. The weeks that followed had their own particular tension, the quiet kind that comes when a machine has been stopped but hasn't yet been dismantled. Restoration crews arrived by court order to fill the trench, and I watched from my porch as they pushed the dirt back into the wound in my meadow. The field was scarred, but it was healing. More neighbors stopped by. Carol, who had been fined into selling her home at a loss. Hank, a widower who had been threatened with foreclosure over 2 months of missed dues. Each story was a shard of the same broken pattern. Control through fear, profit through intimidation. I had become something I hadn't intended to be, a beacon. People were looking to me not just as the man who fought the HOA, but as proof that standing your ground could actually matter. Then Marian called with news that made me lean against the wall. The state attorney's office had taken interest. With Brenda's testimony and the financial records tying Meridian to the HOA's operations, criminal charges were being considered: fraud, conspiracy, and potentially racketeering. This was no longer just a civil matter. Within weeks, Cassandra resigned, citing health reasons in a letter mailed to every homeowner. Behind the scenes, Leah reported that she was negotiating to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency. The woman who had stood in my field with that practiced smile, telling me to tread carefully, was now the one treading water. Meridian issued corporate press releases dripping with doublespeak about community commitment and landowner respect. Leah's follow-up article shredded them. She had emails proving Meridian executives had explicitly encouraged the HOA to fast-track easements and minimize community backlash. That phrase, community backlash, said everything. To them, people like me weren't neighbors with rights. We were obstacles to be managed and moved. Brenda was indicted for forgery. Cassandra, facing her own charges, agreed to testify against Meridian executives. The HOA board crumbled, its meetings reduced to skeleton attendance, its reputation in pieces. Victory tasted bittersweet, as honest victories often do. My workshop still carried the echoes of those long nights spent scanning for headlights through the window. The meadow carried the faint memory of the trench. The war wasn't fully over. Corporations like Meridian don't vanish when they lose a round, and HOAs don't surrender their appetite for control simply because a judge orders them to stop. But something had fundamentally changed, and I felt it every morning when I stepped onto my porch. The orange flags were gone. The engines were quiet. My neighbors nodded at me with a kind of recognition I hadn't seen before, and the filing cabinet in my office held a paper trail that would outlast all of them. One evening, Franklin and I sat on my porch watching the sunset burn across the sky in shades of orange and gold that bore no resemblance to survey flags. He took a slow sip of coffee. "You did what most of us only dreamed about, Jackson. You stood up to them and lived to tell it." I shook my head. "I just didn't have the sense to back down." He chuckled. "That's the difference. Some people call it stubbornness. I call it backbone." Leah came by one last time for a final interview. She asked what I had learned through all of it. I looked past her to the meadow in the evening light and said, "That land is more than property. It's memory, sweat, sacrifice. The moment you let someone trample it, you've lost more than dirt. You've lost yourself." Her recorder clicked off and she smiled softly. "That's the line, Jackson. That's the truth people need to hear." Now, months later, as I sit on this porch with the sun going down low and orange over Redwood County in a color I have learned to love again, I feel the weight finally, genuinely lifting. The trench is filled. The flags are a memory. The system is grinding forward slowly but surely. Executives indicted, board members testifying, documents unsealed. I know the story isn't completely over, but I also know this. When they came for me, I stood, and that stand lit a fire that others could see from miles away. That, I think, is the real victory. Not just the land saved, or the injunction won, or even the criminal charges filed. It's the proof, visible, documented, public, that ordinary people armed with truth and stubbornness can push back against power. That when you drag a fraud into the light, you take away its ability to breathe. That silence is permission, and that the moment you raise your voice, you discover how many others were waiting to stand beside you. If you've ever faced an HOA nightmare, a corporation that thought it owned your rights, or a system that counted on your exhaustion to win, share your story in the comments. You are not alone in this fight, and your story matters. Hit like if this one gave you something to hold on to, and subscribe because more of these are coming. We shine light where others want shadows. See you in the next one.